Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Business South Carolina. I'm your host, Rick Jenkins, and I appreciate you joining us, whether you are watching us on YouTube, checking out our videos there, or maybe you have downloaded our podcast on Apple or Spotify or Google. Regardless of how you are with us today, I'm glad you found us. We're going to have a good conversation now. We're going to be talking about DEI, workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, or again, DEI. They have long been the cornerstones, among the cornerstones by which a strong company culture is built. DEI practices are meant to enable equality of opportunity, to promote openness, and to fight bias and discrimination. However, DEI efforts are increasingly becoming part of a national political debate, more so and more so as we go on over these past couple years. I'm going to give you some statistics here. According to a recent survey, 56% of employed Americans say that focusing on increasing DEI efforts in the workplace is a good thing. 56% is good. However, that means that 44% aren't so sure. Opinions about DEI vary considerably, and of course it's along demographic and, to no surprise, political lines. Some are now scrutinizing traditional DEI efforts in the workplace, and answers sometimes are often complicated and not so easy. But here to help me have this conversation today is someone who I've been looking forward to talk to about this for quite some time, and it's Dr. Nika White. Dr. Nika White, she is an international authority on DEI. She is an author. She's written books. She knows it all. Nika, welcome.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks for having me. I look forward to this conversation.
I have too. We've been talking about having this conversation for a while, and so thankfully now here we are at the desk, ready to talk business. Good to see you.
Ready to talk business. Thank you.
You're welcome. First, before we get into it all, I just want to talk about Nika for a second. So you've got another book. You've had 3 books.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so your third book came out not too long ago. And the way that I found that it came out is I'm looking through LinkedIn, and I see a post by my friend Nika, who is at Times Square in New York City. And Nika looks up at those huge electronic digital billboards, and she sees a picture of yourself and a picture of your book. Yeah. Bestseller, right?
Yes.
How about that?
That is correct.
Yeah.
So I am an author of 3 books. My most recent work is Inclusion Uncomplicated, a transformative guide to simplify DEI. And it's published by Forbes Books. It was released at the end of January. So my book baby is a little over 6 months old now.
Book baby, I love it.
Yeah. And it's been really exciting to be a part of seeing people's reactions to the book. So I have really appreciated the support and the engagement. You know, I just love having conversations with individuals about what they've learned, how they're processing it, what they've applied from the book.
Right.
But yeah.
An international expert. I don't often get to talk to international experts, but I am today. Nika, let's talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Tell me, what are its origins? I mean, how did DEI, that terminology, come into existence, and how is it in our workforce, our workplaces?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I appreciate being able to go back to the genesis, because DEI is not new in the United States at all. It has been around for quite some time. In fact, DEI first came on the scene during the 1960s around the civil rights movement. And it was a way for organizations to become much more intentional and smarter about how do they create these workplaces where people now are being integrated, right? So that everyone has an opportunity to succeed. It was also right on the heels of the employment laws that were passed during that time, including affirmative action. So organizations really needed a way to help the culture of the organization to be able to navigate what was new for everyone at that time, which was, of course, part of that integration.
Right. And this was early 60s. And as you pointed out, on the heels of the civil rights movement, of course, that hit its zenith in maybe the late 50s or so. And that's when DEI became a part of our lexicon, even though it did not, I think, become the part that it lives in today until, I don't want to say recently, because it's not recently, but is it fair to say over the last decade, 7, 8, 10 years?
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
That is completely fair. This body of work and this discipline has evolved tremendously over time. it now includes, and it has included, many other dimensions of diversity outside of just the racial piece. And so now we have to think about sexual orientation. We have to think about people with disabilities. We have to also consider neurodiversity. So there's so many different dimensions of diversity that now people are paying attention to and making sure that they are adjusting their workplaces appropriately to make sure that everyone can thrive. And so it continues to evolve. I will say that the power of DEI really has garnered a lot of attention and additional support because of some really unfortunate circumstances that have taken place in our society. So one that's probably top of mind for so many people is the murder of George Floyd back in 2020. That is when there was this huge groundswell of support from organizations to feel inclined to be a bit more intentional about trying to really address and navigate what their brown and Black employees were feeling in the workplace and how to really support them. And so DEI practitioners all over were inundated during that time. And so while it was good to be able to see a heightened level of awareness, what we found 3 years later is that a lot of the promises and the commitments that were made, they ring hollow. And there hasn't been tremendous amount of movement to the extent in which we were hoping.
Before we go further in that, let's just define it for a second. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Tell me the difference between the three.
I'll be happy to, and this is an important question. So collectively, all three are value sets and really intentionality around creating spaces and places where people of all types of backgrounds and demographics can feel that they can thrive, right, and be successful. But let's talk about the distinction between them. Diversity is here and happening. You know, there's nothing that we need to do to create diversity. It is really just a point of respect in which things differ. And when we think about it from a workplace perspective, it is the mix of all of those different types of people from different background, experiences, demographics, dwelling in that same environment. And so nothing that we need to do to create diversity. But when we think about inclusion, Rick, it is the opposite in the sense that it has everything to do with action, right? So we can't be passive about the work of inclusion. We have to be very intentional. We have to be calibrated, calculated, strategic. We have to have foresight to understand that the journey that we're on to create that inclusion is going to yield a reward. And so that's this distinction between diversity and inclusion.
Give me an example of inclusion.
Inclusion is, I am now, the example that comes to mind that so many people are aware of, I'll share, and this is actually referencing another DEI practitioner that I have great admiration for, Verne Myers. She actually just recently transitioned from being the Global Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Netflix when she runs her own consultancy. But she says that diversity is being invited to the party, right? So everyone gets an invitation, everyone. And then inclusion is once you're at the party, you're being invited to dance.
Ah,
yeah.
Beautiful. I love it. I love it.
And I often extend that and I talk about it's not only being invited to dance, but maybe someone is also inviting you over to the beverage station or the refreshment station. They're asking you questions and really engaged in who you are, right? You know, perhaps they are introducing you to other individuals because they just think that much of you, right? Yeah. And so it certainly has a look and feel about it, right? Now,
so it's like the equivalent of being in high school, and we have all colors in high school, depending on your high school, of course. However, there are niches in high school, right?
Yes.
And sometimes you're not allowed in my niche.
Oh, exactly.
And I might not be allowed in yours. I mean,
absolutely.
That's
the insider, outsider, mentality is real. People experience it every single day. And so what you are describing is precisely just that. Yeah.
Right.
And then we get to the equity piece. This is the part, Rick, that I find that most people are challenged by, right? Is there's a lot of complexity around the equity piece. Oftentimes, it is used interchangeably with equality. And while they are interconnected, there is a very important distinction that has to be made. Equality is giving everyone the same thing. And the expectation is that giving everyone the same thing is going to yield success for everyone. The problem with that is that we all do not start at the same place, which means we all may have vastly different needs in order for us to be successful. And so if we are operating with a mindset of equity, a lens of equity, we are thinking very intently about what are the individual needs of the people that we want to be successful, right? And when you think about it from a workplace perspective, We don't hire people to our organizations to not be successful, because their success is part of the team's success, the department's success, the organization's success. And so we have to really be intentional to understand what are those needs, what are those gaps, and how do we bridge the gap, even if it means it could look different from person to person.
Let's talk about some examples. I mean, one that comes to mind immediately is tried and true harassment, right? But give me some specific examples, including examples that may exist today but did not exist a few years ago.
So this question is important as well. When we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, why it has such an important role in our society, it is because there have been a series of issues that many people, particularly those who are part of marginalized communities, that have experienced from time to time, that has not allowed them to show up authentically or to have full opportunity for success. And so you mentioned harassment. I also will add to the list the unconscious bias piece and the microaggressions. You know, some have probably heard of the statement, death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? There is nothing micro about microaggressions. In fact, they can be very macro. And when you think about the totality of all of those experiences adding up, it can create some serious issues for people within the workplace.
Tell me about microaggression.
Yeah, so microaggressions are very subtle. Sometimes you don't even know that it's happening.
Are we talking like passive aggressive?
Well, in some regards, but sometimes what makes it so tricky, Rick, is that the person who is on the receiving end of it, the victim, sometimes they don't even know that it's happening. And it's because they begin to interrogate what's taken place, and they'll ask themselves, will I be believed if I bring this up? Am I just being too sensitive?
Right.
And I think that what happens is when people start to harbor those thoughts, they'll end up just kind of letting it go and not saying anything.
And I would guess that these microaggressions are easier for the person who is doing them to deny too in some situation, right?
That's precisely where I was going next.
She thought that, or he thought that I meant. I didn't mean that.
Yes, exactly. Right? Are you sure you heard it that way?
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
right.
Well, this person jokes with everyone like that, right. You know. And so it certainly undermines one's thoughts and opinions and experiences. And I think that it's really important for us to believe people when they come forth and they share information of microaggressions being a part of their experience in the workplace. But we have to provide a training to allow people to understand when it shows up, what it looks like, how to disrupt it, right? What's the impact of it to the entire organization? And microaggressions, they happen every single day.
I would think that it is way more difficult to manage these types of things today in today's workplace than it was several years ago. And I would think that it is getting more difficult and more difficult and more difficult as time goes past. Yeah. Yes?
Absolutely. It can be a very polarizing topic, although it shouldn't be. I often say that resistance is a lack of clarity. So what I believe as a practitioner in this space is that where we're going to be able to gain some ground around the divisiveness that exists right now around this topic of DEI is to continue to provide learning experiences where people can build up their awareness, their understanding. And that even means to learn, relearn, and unlearn misinformation that we've all been exposed to, right?
Unlearn.
Yes, absolutely. But it has evolved so much. And I think that we are finding that with some of the recent decisions that have been made, like I think about the Supreme Court decision, the ruling on affirmative action in higher learning institutions and other government, organizations, that is certainly having an impact on how in which people are navigating this work.
Yeah, I want to make sure that we understand where you're going with that. So it was the Supreme Court, and I don't know how long ago it's been now. It's probably been a few months.
Yeah, a few months.
But they ruled that colleges, and this came from a lawsuit that is involving Harvard and a few other colleges, but it's an umbrella type of decision. They ruled that colleges can no longer specifically take race into account as a basis for admission into a college. Now, opponents, and I just want to stick on this for a second, opponents of that ruling say that it is a monumental threat to racial equality, and proponents say that race should never have been a factor in making the decision on whether that person got into college in the first place, right? What do you think?
Well, those individuals are ill-informed. And I say that strictly because if you don't take our history into account, then your perspective is going to be that that history no longer is valid and no longer has relevance to these types of decisions. And they absolutely do. And so while this decision has certainly impacted a lot of ways in which now higher learning institutions are governing themselves, right, to be compliant, it also is impacting the corporate world, the workplace, right? We get a lot of our talent from higher learning institutions. And if that is now where organizations are finding it appropriate to recruit from, then we have to ensure that those institutions are admitting students of diverse backgrounds, including those who are part of marginalized communities who have a history of being victims of systems of oppression and discrimination. And I'm glad to see that a lot of institutions are finding very creative ways to combat that because it shows forth their leadership and their ability to recognize the value of a diverse student body population.
I want to make sure I understand what you're saying and how you feel about it. So let me give you a specific example for you to respond to. And yes, you just mentioned that colleges are being creative about how they're going to handle this, and I think that bodes well. But a specific example. So let's say that we have a black man, a white woman, and an Asian man. Okay, and they only have room for one of them to get into Harvard. I'm only using Harvard because that's maybe the black man is not as qualified as the other two. However, in order to meet goals, Harvard or whatever college that is feel that they need to let him or her in, even though these other two may be more qualified. So just to make sure I understand, what are you saying is the reason that, oh, no, he should be the one you choose?
Yeah, I think we have to take a step back. And what I want to bring to the conversation is that what your example is at the moment of the decision making, right? Mm-hmm. I think that where a lot of organizations fall short is what are we doing well before the time of need to ensure that we're building up a diverse applicant pool of candidates across many different backgrounds. I always say, hire the best person for the job, appoint the best person for the job, but are you exercising rigor and due diligence with the strategies that have been laid out, because there's so many best practices to ensure a diverse applicant pool? And if you cannot answer that definitively, then there's still some work to be done.
But if you have a diverse applicant pool, and I just gave you an example of diversity sitting at the table, but we're going to choose one that may not be, as you said, hire the best person for the job.
Hire the best person for the job.
In this situation, admit the best person to college.
Yes, admit the best person to college, right. Absolutely. When we think about hiring the best person for the job, what I often see is that individuals will question whether or not diverse talent are qualified. I'll hear conversations like, let's make sure that we hire a qualified, diverse candidate. And it baffles me because when have we ever gone into a hiring situation thinking that we were going to hire somebody unqualified? Mm-hmm. And I think that needs to be challenged, and we need to have people to interrogate why they're asking that question. Why are they phrasing that? I believe that right now, when we are thinking about hiring diverse talent, we automatically maybe sometimes could assume that the quality of productivity and of intellect is not going to be there. And I want to challenge that assumption.
When there was a time when we were talking about DEI measures that we were wanting to make sure that it included sexual orientation and, disabilities and religion and gender and all that kind of stuff. However, there's been something else that has been thrown into the mix over the last few years, and that is gender identification. Mm-hmm. That is something that we now have to take into consideration. Thoughts about that?
Well, I think that we have to recognize, as I mentioned early on when you asked about the distinction between diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity is not just about the optics of age, race, and gender. It is so much broader than that. And we, as a society, we have to become much more sophisticated in how in which we talk about and define diversity. So when we think about the LGBTQIA+ community, it's not just about sexual orientation and sexual preference. We have to think about the totality of what all those letters mean. And there is such a division around sometimes the LGBTQIA community. And what I think that people have to realize is that agreement does not always mean acceptance, right? I think that we can accept the difference and we can coexist without us leaving people in a position where they are not dignified. They're not treated with the sense of humanity and respect that they deserve, right? And so this is about a human rights type of conversation as well. And if we can get to a point where we're centering the humanity conversation, I truly believe that as a society, we'll be better off.
You mentioned the letters, and I think that it's the number of letters now that we deal with that is causing some of the pushback and the challenges. There was a time when it was a couple letters, and you just said a couple, and please excuse my ignorance, but I did not know the last two letters. LGBTQ.
IA plus. Yes. So this is where the onus becomes really important at the individual level. What are we doing to educate ourselves?
Yes.
What are we doing to build up our cultural intelligence, our cultural humility? Because it is so easy to sit back and question and even to find fault in something that we don't understand. Change of any kind positions us in a negative, way. And so what are we doing? That's why I find it to be very appropriate when organizations are providing different types of learning experiences for people to get proximate to the lived experiences of those who are different from them. We have to stop classifying diversity or difference as right, wrong, good or bad, superior, inferior. It's just different, right? And I want us to get to that point where we can embrace that.
Good thoughts, Nika. I tell you, we still have several things that I want to talk about, but I want to take a commercial break before we get into the next conversation. I want to discuss, when we come back from and we're all going to be gone in 60 seconds. When we come back, I want to discuss the challenge to DEI efforts in the workplace that is related to what I'm going to call wokeism or an anti-woke movement. And that has become, that now goes hand in hand, unfortunately, with DEI efforts in the workforce and so in the workplace. And so we're going to talk about that. And I'm going to do it with Dr. Nika White as soon as we get back. Welcome back, everyone, to Let's Talk Business South Carolina. I'm your host, Rick Jenkins, and I am joined today by Dr. Nika White. And she is the owner and founder and CEO of Nika White Consulting, and she is an international expert on DEI, and that's what we've been discussing for the last 15 or 20 minutes, and we're going to continue the conversation here for a little while longer. Nika, thanks.
Thanks for having me, Rick.
Yep, you're welcome. Okay, as I said, we've been having this conversation about DEI, again, diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace, and about how those efforts can impact a company culture. However, our culture has changed drastically over the last few years, and it continues to change. With the onset, I'm going to call them woke ideals or wokeism or some anti-woke pushback. And so, and I think everyone understands that, but this is a challenging conversation, and it's one that doesn't always have easy answers. And the answers sometimes are complicated. It's not always a black-white issue, no pun intended. It lives in the gray area sometimes, right? And so I want to explore that a little bit with you, Nika. But before we do, I want to talk about defining woke for a second, okay? And I want to tell a quick little story. And this is a story you may have heard or you may not. I did not know it until I was doing a little research for the conversation. Back in the late 1930s, there was a Black American folk singer, and his name was Hetty Ledbetter. Okay. First of all, Hetty is a wonderful first name, and Ledbetter is a wonderful second name, and you put them together, you have a magnificent name, okay? Hetty Ledbetter. But what is even better than being called Hetty Ledbetter is that he was known in the music industry as Leadbelly. So Hetty Ledbetter, also known as Leadbelly, used the term stay woke in a song that he wrote back in 1938. And this song, and I did some research. Now woke existed, the term woke existed long before this song, but in outside the United States. But in America, this was one of the very first times that it was used. Now, so he wrote this song, and it was about 7 or 8 Black teenagers and young men who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women. And he wrote this song, and this happened in Scottsboro, Alabama. And he was being interviewed after the song came out and received some exposure. And this is his quote. He said, I advise everybody to be a little careful when they go through Scottsboro. It's best to stay woke and keep your eyes open. Now, of course, what Leadbelly meant at that time was, let's be awake. Let's make sure that we understand the problems that are in our society that exist because of racial injustices. Stay awake, folks. Be aware. Now, that was 1938, and that was my good friend Leadbelly. What has happened, Nika, since 1938, when Leadbelly put this in a song, between then, what he meant then, and what it means today? What has happened?
People have been misinformed. And so when I think about being woke, it is simply just someone who is well informed about racial and social issues, right? And so the story that you told, I am familiar with it. And what kept coming up for me as you were sharing this story is eyes wide open, really. And that's what he was saying. Right. You know, make sure that your eyes are wide open when you're going through this environment, this place, because in its history, there have been examples of situations where people have been harmed. And so, you know, when we think about the racial issues that exist and the racial inequalities that exist and inequities that exist in our society today, it is important for people to be well informed and to do their part in helping to create greater parity around, you know, the differences between races. And so I am saddened that you know, wokeism has been weaponized to the point to where it is losing its power and it's creating great level of division. I feel like it's really misunderstood. And so I'm glad that we're having this conversation today, because hopefully it will bring some clarity to folks who have been maybe trying to stay away from conversations like this.
Right. Let's talk about that division. A USA Today poll came out, it wasn't too long ago, maybe a month or so ago, and the poll showed that Americans are divided on whether woke is a compliment or an insult. 60% of Republicans and 25% of Democrats actually say they feel it is an insult. And also within that survey, 56% of Americans say that what woke means to them is to be informed, educated on, and aware of social injustices, okay? But 39% say that in their opinion, woke means to be overly politically correct and to police others' words, feelings, actions, so forth and so on. Thoughts?
So when I think about the latter part of what you just shared, that definition, to me what comes to mind is what also has been referred to as the council culture. Now, I am not a practitioner that believes in the council culture. I believe that we need everyone to arrive to this conversation and to this work because they see the value of it and they understand it. We are going to make mistakes. And so when people are called out, I think that it does create this this tendency to want to stay on the sidelines or not engage or to be offended, right? And so, you know, there's also this big phenomenon of helping people to understand how do we call in the behavior, which is a difference from calling a person out. So I wanted to make that distinction. I believe that those who are anti-woke has everything to do with a misunderstanding around what it means, and they probably are relating more to the council culture. I believe that in order for all of us to be able to live in a society that we deserve and where we all have opportunity for success, we're going to have to make sure that we're engaging people of all types, right? And so that is the reason that I tend to stray away from council culture type of activity.
You know, I would say that proponents of the, again, lack of better phrasing, anti-woke movement would say that it is political correctness run amok. And that we've added too many letters, and that we've just gone to an extreme and we've taken it too far. I guess my question to you, and this is a tough one, Nika, my question is, can you see, understand, identify with that point that some of those people might feel?
Typically, from my experience, people who are against wokeness, it has everything to do with misunderstanding it or digging their heels in around a position of not wanting to understand. willful ignorance, honestly, is how I refer to it. I do think there's a lot of misinformation out there that people have gravitated to, and it has shaped one's thoughts and perspectives. And again, part of being on this journey is learning, unlearning, relearning, and just being open to hearing different perspectives, you know. Right. So yeah, I think a lot of the accountability and responsibility is on the individual to want to unlearn the misinformation, to want to engage in data that helps them to be much more open to really what woke means.
For executives that are in the workplace and they are tasked with meeting DEI goals and making their workplace a more diverse, inclusive place to work, their jobs are tougher today than they were a few years ago. Advice for those folks?
Lean into it. You know, tough does not mean impossible. I think that from a DEI leader perspective, it's going to take really thinking innovatively around how we continue to navigate the minefield. There are a lot of champions and ambassadors. We have to find who those individuals are within the organizations and not feel like the voice behind this work is solely the responsibility of the person that carries that title. Being inclusion-minded, being, you know, having a lens of equity, that is all leadership, and not leadership by way of a title or position, but by way of influence. And when we think about it in that regard, we can influence no matter where we are within an organization. I would also say that it's critically important to align on what are those guardrails, right? That from a leadership perspective, we all can agree to be a part of how we want DEI to manifest in the organization. Without having those conversations, and I like to refer to them as readiness conversations, you're going to find yourselves, you know, not necessarily aligned. And I think that alignment is so critical. The reason that I believe a lot of organizations were caught off guard by the Supreme Court's decision is because they were not fully aligned. They thought they were. They thought that everybody knew how DEI should look and feel within the organization, but then once they really started to get granular around it, there was some dissension there. So they needed to really bring that back into a place of commitment where everybody was really fully behind it. I also think that gathering data is really critical. I believe in evidence-based data to help inform decisions, right? And that requires us to get proximate to the lived experiences of people that are different from us. Where you sit within an organization, Rick, determines what you see. And what you see becomes your lens. And your lens, it certainly influences your decision-making. So who are we considering when we're making decisions that impact such a broad group of diverse people?
Nika, fantastic. Fantastic stuff. Folks, this is Dr. Nika White. She is the CEO and president, founder of Nika White Consulting, and an internationally renowned expert on DEI. That was a good conversation, a tough conversation in some regard, tough in the sense that it's just not easy. It's just not easy, and it's not going to get any easier. But I appreciate you helping me talk it out, and I enjoyed it, as always.
I did too, Rick, and thank you for bringing this conversation to your audience.
You are welcome. Folks, we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be back with another guest. Don't go anywhere. Be right back.